told you was true, from a certain point of view.
A prophecy that misread could have been.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Unlearn what you have learned.
Well, welcome back to People of the Free Gift Podcast. And today we are continuing along with the ministry of Jesus and going through the Gospels. And today we're going to be in Mark and Luke, and Mark 12 and Luke 21, and talking about a very particular widow, often known as the widow's mite. But as we jump into this passage, we're going to take it on a little bit differently than we have. We go kind of verse by verse, and sometimes we don't even get through a whole verse before we stop and make some comments. I'm going to read this entire passage because it's really only four verses, but in it, I believe that Jesus addresses and starts to shatter certain myths about generosity, certain excuses that we put up as to why we're not more generous, and why we kind of set up these rules and boundaries that, we're not supposed to talk about it in church, things like that. If you want to be entered into a drawing to win a gift card of your choice for $20, here's how you do it. You click on the subscribe button, and in your comments, you're going to say what your Facebook name is. And the reason is because you're also going to need to share this video on social media. That's all you have to do. So we start out in Mark 12:41, and Jesus sat out over against the treasury, and beheld how the people cast money into the treasury, and many that were rich cast in much. And there came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 coins worth 2/5 of a cent. And he called unto him his disciples, and said unto them, Verily I say unto you, that this poor widow has cast more in than all they which have cast into the treasury. For all they did cast in unto the offerings of God, and out of which they had left. But she, of what she was lacking, did cast in all she had, even all her living. And so a simple story, a simple account, and let's go ahead and jump in and talk about the different myths that this raises and addresses and shatters in regards to generosity and giving. And so the first myth that I see in regards to giving that often comes up is that what I give is nobody's business. And this is something that kind of just it's a general rule, you're not supposed to talk about religion and politics when you're at family occasions. Well, when you go into church, then they say, well, you're not supposed to talk about money. And I just want to reassure everybody who's listening, that might be from my church. I don't know what anybody's giving. I don't sit there looking when we take the offering, who's giving, who's not. I really don't know. So it's not going to affect in any way. And it wouldn't, even if I did know, it wouldn't affect how I treated you. But one of the things that really stuck out to me as I was reading this passage is that Jesus, he's there with the disciples, but the disciples are kind of sidetracked. And Jesus, he's just looking at the temple, and he's looking at this line of people that are coming up and placing their offering in their giving. And he's paying attention to who it is, what they're giving, how they're giving. He's kind of looking at the expressions on their faces. And, it just kind of says to me, like, Jesus didn't really have a problem with seeing who was giving and who was not giving and all of that. And in fact, he calls his disciples' attention. He calls them over and he says, hey, look, watch this woman, right? And he points to this widow, and she's going up and she gives her offering, which is, he just sees her throw like a couple of coins in there, which in our vernacular is basically like 2/5 of a cent. That is the equivalent, they say, of one of their other coins that was still not worth much compared to our, economy kind of thing. And he says, I tell you that woman right there, she's given more than all these other guys. All these other guys, they're giving out of what they have as in their abundance. They're rich, and so they give a lot, and so they get a lot of attention, and people, ooh and ah, and they treat them differently. But this woman, I tell you that she has given more than the rest of them. And so Jesus didn't really take the same mentality that we do. He talked about money freely, and he didn't have this rule in this guideline that says, you shouldn't talk about money, Jesus. You're the Messiah. You shouldn't talk about money. It's your church. And so what I give is nobody's business. That's the first myth that we need to deal with. But we don't say this about anywhere else. Like we don't go into Macy's and go, all Macy's wants is my money. Right? No, they're providing a service and we're paying them for that service. And if we don't want their service because Walmart can sell us something cheaper, then we're going to go to Walmart and we're going to avail ourselves of their services. They're going to get our money, but we don't sit there and complain. We might complain about how much the cost is, but we don't say, all that they want is my money. Like, no, we know why they exist and what the purpose of that is and what the transaction is. Sometimes we get confused, though, when we come to church, thinking that somehow all of the things that happen around us are just, they don't cost anything, they don't have any value to them, and so we treat it differently than we do. But I notice again that Jesus didn't do that. But the other thing I would say is that we really are hypocrites when it comes to this. What I give is nobody's business. But then when January and February and March and April come around, okay, when you get your W-2s, you're going to file this thing called a tax return. And when you file your tax return, I guarantee you that a large majority of us are going to tell our tax guy or TurboTax or however you do it, okay, we are going to tell the IRS how much we gave in charitable giving this year. Now, here's the irony of that, is that I maybe some of you are exceptions, but every single year this happens to me. I fill out my TurboTax, and it walks me through every single solitary possible exemption that there might be. And at the end of it, after I've done all that work and gone through all of it, it says, we're going to give you the automatic ordinary deduction that you would have even if you hadn't done all of that stuff. Now, the fact that I did all of that stuff and it's in the paperwork, but then they're giving me the automatic, it makes it less likely that I'm going to get audited, and I'm not declaring these crazy amounts. But here's the thing, the amount that you would have to declare to get past, the amount you would have to give and claim on your taxes as charitable giving in order to get past that initial barrier is such a ridiculous amount that almost none of us ever really qualified, but it's something that we're emphatic that we have to do. So this whole deal that what I give is nobody's business is really just a myth. And let's just shatter that right now, and Jesus helps us do that. So the second myth is people give because it makes them feel good. And this is like the altruistic, like people, well, actually, it's not altruistic. Altruism is when you're doing something simply for the purpose of doing that thing. Okay, and we're going to get to that myth in a minute. But people give because it makes them feel good. The reality is this, that giving equals sacrifice. And if you take somebody who makes $50,000 a year, let's just take the 10% amount that we're going to deal with that later. And why 10% is not really a good thing to go off of as the basis for everybody, and why the New Testament doesn't do that. We're going to get to that later. But let's just take the 10% and say $50,000. That's $5,000 that person's going to give of their income. Now, I think every single one of us could think about a lot of different things that we would spend $5,000 on. But the person who is giving $5,000 of their $50,000 understands something about God's principles that puts more value on that and the fact that they have the opportunity to give than they do on, say, taking a vacation or, buying some nice things, furniture or, appliances, whatever that you might buy with $5,000, or just having $5,000 in your savings account, putting away in a college fund, something like that. The people who are giving are putting a higher value on the giving and understanding what God's doing in and through that than they do on all those other things. So you have to understand that the giving is a sacrifice, and the people are choosing to do that. So it's not necessary when you sacrifice something, it doesn't always make you feel good. Okay, you know that you're letting go of something, and the reality is, if you're not giving enough to where you know that you're getting rid of something or giving up something that you would have otherwise, then you're probably not exercising what God, the way that Jesus would intend. And so Jesus is pointing out, what Jesus points out about this woman is that she's literally giving everything that she has. She's just like, this isn't even enough to meet my own needs, and so I don't even have enough, so I'm just going to give everything I have. This is like a last-ditch effort. I'm just going to give everything I have. I'm out. Okay, now let's see what God does, right? Okay, people don't give because it makes them feel good, but here's the thing. People who give are happier. They've actually done studies on this, and they've concluded that people who give are actually happier people because of a number of reasons, okay? One, and again, let's just use the 10% just because, okay? 10% is enough to make a difference. You feel like if I make, now 10% of anybody's income isn't going to make or break anybody. Like one family that gives 10% in a church, and unless they literally make $1 million, is not going to be able to support the budget of a church single-handedly, okay? Every single person, even the most generous giver in any church setting, I guarantee you, it's still like a small percentage. Them, if it's them and only them, it'd be a small percentage. Okay, so, but you still feel like when I'm giving, giving regularly and consistently, and a significant percentage, and 10% is a good round number. Okay, I feel like it's making a dent. It's making a significance. Okay. Whereas if you just toss, a couple of, dollars, here and there, and it's irregular and those kind of things, it's really not adding up to a whole lot of anything. Okay. And so 10% is enough to make a difference. So you feel like you're making a difference when you give. Giving encourages financial responsibility. People who give have to budget because they're thinking about what they're going to give, and typically they give first. And that's something the Bible endorses and encourages. They call it first fruits, okay? So people, in order to do that, you have to budget. You have to live on less than you make. You live debt-free. You spend on what you value. You're grateful for God's provision and its protection against greed. And so all of those things, and then those who give are more cheerful and less depressed. They've just statistically proven that through studies, okay? God loves a cheerful giver. Okay, so then the third myth that we have to deal with is this. If we give, God will make us rich. And so I'm going to show a video of John Piper, and he says it better than I can. I have to bring this one up if we're talking about this. This is a horrible heresy that is being taught in the church, known as the health and the wealth gospel.
I don't know what you feel about the prosperity gospel, the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel, but I'll tell you what I feel about it. Hatred. It is not the gospel. And it's being exported from this country to Africa and Asia, selling a bill of goods to the poorest of the poor. Believe this message. Your pigs won't die. Your wife won't have miscarriages. You have rings on your fingers and coats on your back. That's coming out of America. The people that ought to be giving our money and our time and our lives, instead selling them a bunch of crap called gospel. And here's the reason it is so horrible. When was the last time that any American, African, Asian ever said, Jesus is all satisfying because you drove a BMW? Never. They'll say, Jesus did do that? Yeah, well, I'll take Jesus. That's idolatry. That's not the gospel. That's elevating gifts above giver. I'll tell you what makes Jesus look beautiful is when you smash your car and your little girl goes flying through the windshield and lands like dead on the street. And you say, through the deepest possible pain, God is enough. God is enough. He is good. He will take care of us. He will satisfy us. He will get us through this. He is our treasure. Whom have I in heaven but you? And on earth there's nothing that I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart, my little girl may fail, but you are the strength of my heart and my portion forever. That makes God look glorious. As God, not as giver of cars or safety or health. Oh, how I pray that America would be purged of the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel, and that the Christian church would be marked by suffering for Christ. God is most glorified in you when you are most satisfied in Him in the midst of loss, not prosperity.
So the next myth that we need to address is this, that large one-time donations make more of an impact. And I add this in because, Jesus talks about these guys who come by and they drop in these large donations out of their abundance. And sometimes that happens, wealthy individuals that all of a sudden just come by and drop a load of money, or maybe somebody dies and leaves a large estate to a church. And I'm not saying that they're not valuable, but the truth is that every nonprofit organization or church, they would prefer the regular substantial donations that come in because that's what you can plan on. One-time donations that come in kind of have a tendency to throw off the numbers. Now, there's a time and a place for one-time donations, and the best time and place for that is actually when there's a one-time expense. And so if there's something that is like having to do with vision or repair or something like that, that calls for, a large amount of money, but it's a one-time expense, then that's the best time for one-time donations to come in. And in actuality, I've seen where one-time donations can actually cause problems. And like I said, I've seen several churches in the past, and in fact, I think we have one here in town that is like this, where people in the past, and they were very well-intentioned, they were faithful members of the church, and there's nothing wrong with this. In fact, I would encourage you to do it in a way, but they set up their estate so that a large substantial amount or even a percentage of their money would go to the church. Now, oftentimes when that happens, or if it happens enough times, then that church starts ending up with a bank account that has so much padding that they have in the interest alone enough to be able to meet their expenses. And I've known several churches that were like that. And what ends up happening is that the individuals in that church stop seeing any urgency in terms of giving of their own finances towards the church. And so again, that discipleship gap that occurs, this disconnect between my money and my relationship with God, whereas Jesus didn't have that disconnect and even goes out of his way to bring it up often in the Gospels. And so that often happens. But with that, what I see also, because the bills are paid that we have enough money sitting there and the interest from it to just keep the building maintained and keep a pastor on staff to deliver messages on Sunday, to where we aren't even thinking as the body of Christ to go out and invite, to share the gospel, and so that component of our discipleship gets lost. And so that's what often happens in those churches. And so what ends up happening over time is that you have like one family or a few families that are insisting that they're going to keep that church going, and yet they're not really functioning as a church. And so they have all of these resources and a building and a pastor, but nothing is happening, nothing's getting done. And there's no purpose for the kingdom. And so that's what can happen on like a really negative level with one-time donations. But the best donations, honestly, and this is what the Bible encourages from start to finish, is that you have sacrificial, regular, consistent, whatever the Lord's put on your heart, giving because you want to. Okay, those are the greatest impact of gifts. And so, next myth: giving only counts if you don't want to give, but you do anyway. This is where the altruism thing comes in. That, like, it's only a good deed if you're not getting anything out of it, right? Or like you actually don't even want to do it, but you're doing it anyway because of obligation. Like, that's altruism. And there's very rare occasions in which human beings can be altruistic. The reality is there's some level of everything that we do that we get something out of. Like we already talked about the psychological benefits of giving versus not giving, the purpose that comes with that, the feeling of value, all of those things. Being a generous person often comes with, people being generous back to you. God, pouring out his blessing. You put yourself in line with his blessing. All those kind of things are true. And so it's kind of silly for us to think like, that God would be sitting up in heaven and somebody who's saying, I want to give, he would say, no, I can't have you give yet. You need to get to a place where you don't want to give, and then you need to give anyway. It just doesn't make any sense, because the people who want to give, he wouldn't accept their offering, and the people who don't want to give are probably not going to want to give, and they're not going to give anyway. So God would end up with nothing. So it doesn't make any sense. In fact, he says, I love a cheerful giver. I love a person who gives because they want to give, because that's their heart to give, because that's just what they want to do, because they love me. That's what an offering that's pleasing to God is. Now, in the second to last myth, generosity comes from excess, and this is just not true. And I found a couple of different things, different studies that found, and I have found this generally to be true. And we're going to get into kind of the dynamics a little bit in our next point here, but I wanted to show you a video that I thought was pretty powerful.
Is there any way I could have some food? Any way I could have some food? I'm very hungry. Thank you. Is there any way I could have some food? I'm very hungry. Can I have some food?
Sorry.
Thank you. Is there any way I could have some food?
Sorry?
Is there any way I could have some food? Do you have any extra food? Yeah, very hungry.
I don't know.
Sure.
Hey, excuse me, sir. Are you hungry? Because we actually just bought some food to give to someone, and we were wondering if you would like it. I mean, it's 2 burgers and fries and a drink. Would you like it?
You hungry?
All right, yeah, of course, man. Yeah, of course. Have a good day, man.
Is there any way I could have some food? I'm really hungry. Hey, thank you so much. have you been out here? How long have you been out here?
I lived here most of my life.
Yeah.
Excuse me, sir. Hey, I'm just paying it forward, and I'm actually just helping people that are in need, and I want to give you some like $10, so you can. Yeah, no problem. Man.
Give me a hug. Thank you, brother.
Have a great day.
Yes, sir. I'm not from around here, man.
Me either.
No, where you from?
I'm from Florida.
Florida. Man, how'd you get out here?
Yeah.
You don't happen, you don't happen to have a dollar I could have? Spare a dollar?
Yeah, you get a dollar for it.
Hey, thank you so much.
Yeah.
God bless you.
You give me $10.
Hey, thank you.
There you go.
Appreciate it.
Don't worry about it.
Thank you. What's your name?
Jimmy.
Jimmy? Jeremy.
God bless you.
Hey, Jimmy. Take care, okay? Have a good one.
Thank you.
So our last myth that we're going to address today is that God wants us to give 10%. And this is often known as the tithe. And I wanted to shatter this from a number of different levels. But the first one is this, that even if you're talking about the Old Testament, when you say tithe literally does mean 10%. But the tithe was the base point of giving that was in the Old Testament. And then you had offerings that were on top of the tithe. Then you also had your sin offerings, which would be like bringing animals from your flock. And then there's certain sins that you would commit that God would demand restitution for. And so that would cost physical money. And then on top of that, because God was dealing with Israel as a nation, their taxes were also brought to the temple. And so you're dealing with not 10%, you're dealing with well into like 20, 30, and maybe even higher percentage, depending on how much sin the person committed in their life, of their income would go to God's house. So if you want to deal with an Old Testament style, then that's what you would be dealing with. And that's the reason why in the New Testament, when Jesus, he talks about tithes occasionally, but he always does it in reference to teaching the law. He's always responding to questions about the law. And so he's just saying, this is the reality. You're Jewish, you're under the law. This is the reality about tithing. But never in the New Testament is it encouraged for God's people to tithe, to give 10%. 10% ends up being a round number that we all tend to like. It's an easy calculation too. So when you get your paycheck, and this is something that I do, you get your paycheck, you just kind of move the decimal over, you know how much you're going to give, and you give that first, and then in a way, it just seems like an easy number to calculate, okay? And you can easily just mentally say, if there was 10 families in a church that should support every member on staff kind of thing, then it just kind of seems like it's a number that makes sense. And so a lot of Christians use it. But I know Christians who get well into like the 50% with their giving, and they're just in that life situation. Okay, so in the New Testament, we're encouraged to give as the Lord puts on our hearts. Okay, we're supposed to give cheerfully, and that's the thing I've wanted to really drive home through this message over and over and over again. That it's between you and God. And yes, he does care. And yes, it does have everything to do with your discipleship and your relationship with him. And yes, you will find yourself in a better position just all the way around if you are a generous person than if you're not a generous person. All of those things are absolutely true. And all of the myths that we've been trying to explore are absolutely false. But I'm going to share another reason with you about why 10% is just a silly number that we throw out, it doesn't really practically make a whole lot of sense. Okay, so on your screen there, you see 3 columns. Okay, you see family A, and family A is basically somewhere in the vicinity around minimum wage. Okay, if you make about $10 an hour, you make about $20,000 a year. Okay, roughly, and so that salary, $20,000 a year, if you tithe off of the whole thing, 10%, that would be $2,000, which would mean you would have $18,000 left over. Okay, and don't worry right now about that gap, that bottom number. But then family B makes a salary of $50,000. And if they gave 10%, that would be $5,000, which would be $3,000 more than family A gave, right? So physically, tangibly, that family would have given more to the church. But watch this. They would have $45,000 left over, which means that even after they've given $3,000 more, they would still be able to give another $27,000 before they're living on the same level as family A. Okay, do you get that? Okay, so now let's take a family that's $100,000. They give 10%. They give $10,000, and any family that gives $10,000 in a church, I guarantee you, anybody who knows it, or just kind of they think that they know it, they tend to be treated better, differently, all that kind of stuff. It's not right. It's just true. Okay? And you can read what New Testament James has to say about that mentality. It's just wrong. And here's why it's wrong. Because after that family is given $10,000, they still have $90,000. And that means that they could give another $72,000 before they're living at the same level as family A. But what Jesus did in this passage is he took the woman in family A and he said she just gave 100% of her income and she has nothing left. And everybody's looking at the family C, family B, and all of the money that they're giving. Wow, aren't they generous? Are they really? Comparatively, the reality is I know far more family A's who are far more generous than family C's. They even physically give more than family C. And like I said, I don't know who gives what in this church. I'm just saying in general, from experience, this is just the reality. Family A is more likely to be generous in their nature than families B or C. And yet, when you look at it, and this is why 10% doesn't make any sense. Okay, the reality is, are you giving consistently? Are you giving sacrificially? Are you giving because you love Jesus and not for any other reason? Okay, are you giving what he's put on your heart to give? If you're doing all of those things, then you are doing what the Bible says, and don't let anybody look down on you. Don't let anybody judge you. Don't let anybody manipulate you or make you feel bad, look down on you. Okay? Jesus made a point of highlighting this widow and her 2 fifths of a penny and saying she's given more than the whole lot of them who dumped in a whole bunch of money. And if we could start living our lives like that, being generous people and recognizing and just doing what God has put on our hearts and leaving everybody else alone to do what He's put on their hearts, then we would be so much better off as the people of God, and we would be far, far more effective in being about His kingdom work. I just want to encourage you, if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and share this video with others and this channel with others. It helps every time you do that. It actually helps the channel out financially, and it helps us to grow and get in front of others. If you want to connect with us, we invite you to join the conversation, facebook.com/People of the Free Gift. And until next time, this is Jason from People of the Free Gift, signing off.